Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Meeting House, where we have conversation on religion and American life. I'm your host, Dwight A. Moody, coming to you from the studio in the Blue Ridge Mountains, Hendersonville, North Carolina. We're a little late getting started today. We've had 3 different layers of technical difficulties. I won't go into all the details except to say that our radio connection out of Brunswick, Georgia, is not functioning today. We don't know when it's going to come back on, but we welcome everybody who's watching through Facebook or on YouTube. And we invite you to join our conversation today on religion and American life. I'll have the news, 5 stories, as always, at the top of the show. And then to finish up the show, if I have time, I'll have my commentary for the week entitled, "Are People Really Leaving Church?" But right in the middle of it, my host today, an old friend of mine, Dr. James Merritt. Dr. Merritt is the pastor of Cross Point Church in Metro Atlanta. He also has a television ministry. So he's accustomed to dealing with all these technical issues to try to get things out of a room and onto the larger screen. Dr. Merritt is an old colleague of mine. We were students together back in the seminary. And I think that was 40 years ago, Dr. Merritt. It's great to see you.
Well, Dr. Moody, we'll go Dwight and James now. It's really great to see you. We were talking. It's been over 4 decades since we've seen each other. And man, I just can't tell you again how great it is to see you. And thanks for letting me be on the program.
We're going to have a great conversation. We're going to talk about the post-COVID church culture, not only in Atlanta and at Cross Point, but everywhere. I've had this conversation with many ministers over on the show over the course of the year. And then we're going to talk about the new data from Gallup about the declining church affiliation in the United States and the significance of that. And then Dr. Merritt and I have long roots in the Southern Baptist Convention, and I've been following all of this very closely. As my listeners know, we've been following the developments in the convention, especially as they lead up to the annual meeting in June. And we're going to talk about what's happening in the Southern Baptist Convention. Oh, yeah. And it's going to be great. It's great to see you, James. Who knows where the conversation will go once we get started.
Again, Dwight, great to be with you. We've got some very super fond memories, as you know, from Southern Seminary back in the day. And to see where God has brought both of us is just a testimony to his grace. Good to be with you, buddy.
That's exactly right. And maybe all of that will come up here shortly. I'm going to begin, as I always do, with 5 news stories from the world of religion, brought to you by our sponsor, Perfecto Coffee. You can order coffee, perfectocoffeeinc.com. I encourage you to order some. I'm going to send some coffee to my friend James Merritt for being my guest on the show today. The first from Indianapolis, Indiana. The Sikh community of Indianapolis is mourning the deaths of 4 fellow Sikhs who were killed in the gun violence at the FedEx facility last week. There's no evidence that now deceased killer Brandon Hole targeted Sikhs in his rampage, but the event nevertheless brought intense suffering and anxiety to that small minority community in Indianapolis. They have issued a request to President Biden to appoint a Sikh liaison to the Presidential Commission, which they call the White House Office on Public Engagement. They want to help offset the bigotry, the bias, and the violence they have suffered for decades in the United States. Sikhs adhere to a monotheistic religion that emerged in the 15th century in India, led by a man named Guru Nanak. James, have you ever known any Sikhs?
You know, not really personally, Dwight. I have met some through the years in my travels, particularly over in the East.
Right.
And I have met some. They seem like very good, decent people. I don't know that I've never really had a long personal conversation with any of them.
They have a reputation for being very disciplined and very, very good citizens. And they, of course, a minority community almost everywhere in the world, certainly in Indianapolis. And I'm sure there are groups of them in Atlanta. Our sympathies go out to them and their whole community as they're dealing with this tragedy. From Minneapolis, all of our eyes have been on Minneapolis for the last weeks. Faith groups across the religious landscape have been caught in the crosshairs of response to the trial of Derek Chauvin and the killing of Dante Wright, almost back to back. For instance, the Kenya Community Seventh-day Adventist Church sits adjacent to the police precinct headquarters in Brooklyn Center. Like other churches at the center of protest, the Adventist Church considers itself a safe space, a refuge, and a source for water and sustenance to people who are protesting, as well as to the police. The Lutheran Church of the Master opened its facilities to a medical group. Their pastor, Jim Verbeau, said the church isn't taking sides in the events. He said, "I support Black Lives Matter and I support Blue Lives Matter," end quote. Faith leaders gathered in Los Angeles expressed surprise at the verdict. And in response to that verdict, noted Jewish writer Jeffrey Salkin penned what is known as a Kaddish, which is a form of prayer used in Jewish tradition to praise God. And it was written in the memory of George Floyd. From Lynchburg, Virginia, Liberty University fires one Falwell and sues another. The university was founded by Jerry Falwell Sr. and was led until this year by his son, Jerry Falwell Jr. Falwell Jr. resigned in disgrace, as we all remember. But the university this week filed a $40 million lawsuit against Falwell Jr. It claims that he withheld scandalous and potentially damaging information from the Board of Trustees while negotiating a new, very generous contract for himself in 2019. Meanwhile, Falwell's son, Trey, has been removed as vice president of university operations. Trey Falwell, in his early 30s, earned a salary of $234,310, it is reported, and he also operated a real estate management company that oversees a shopping plaza owned by the university. James, I know you've been following all this over there in Lynchburg. It's hard to remember a bigger tragedy or scandal in American Christianity over the last couple of decades than what's happened at Liberty University.
Well, Dwight, full disclosure to your audience, I was on the board at Liberty for quite a few years. I got off the board the year after Dr. Falwell died. I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah.
But I wish I could say I was surprised. Not. It's everybody's a loser. I was very close to Dr. Falwell, Dwight, and I just can't even imagine what Dr. Falwell would be thinking right now. Whatever else anybody thinks about Dr. Falwell, I knew the man very well. He was a man of God. He loved the Lord. His life was as pure and clean as the driven snow, and he was a man of tremendous integrity. And yet I know he loved his sons, and I know the disappointment would be great. But this is a situation, Dwight, as you know, everybody loses. There are no winners in a situation like this. It's a black eye on Christian education. It's a black eye on the church. It's a black eye on Christianity. It's just a real tragedy. And my prayers go out to that school that, they may be down, but they're not out. And I really believe and pray and hope that the school will come back strong.
I appreciate that perspective, James. Thank you for that personal perspective on what has been a major story in Christian education for the last 60 years, really. From Washington, D.C., faith groups across the board pushed back against the Biden administration's recent announcement that they would raise the refugee resettlement target number, from the 12,000 persons set by the Trump administration by only 3,000, up to 15,000. The chairman of the Migration Committee of the U.S. Conference of Catholic bishops, the Reverend Mario Dorsonville, expressed keen disappointment of the Catholic Church and called for an expanded welcome to refugees. Matthew Sorens, a spokesperson for World Relief, called the initial Biden plan, quote, a breathtaking betrayal of the plan to build back better, end quote. 6 of the 9 agencies contracted by the U.S. government to resettle refugees are faith-based, including Church World Service and the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. So in response, the Biden administration has reversed a course, lifted the original target number, and announced that they would set a new expanded goal by May the 15th. And I, for one, am really glad to hear this, as all people, you know, one of the central things that Jesus commanded us to do was welcome the stranger. And I'm delighted that they're going to see this. I'm sure Atlanta gets a lot of the refugees and immigrants coming into the great metropolis of Atlanta. Do you all have a refugee ministry at the church?
We do have a ministry to help with internationals over in Clarkston, Georgia. We do some work, some help there. And I will tell you, Dwight, not to get into politics, but nobody's perfect. That was one of the disappointments to me of the Trump administration. And I'm glad that the Biden administration stepped in to do some, but I do believe they need to do more. I believe not just what I don't believe just what Lady Liberty stands for in New York. I believe what the Bible stands for.
Yeah.
And, we ought to have heart, particularly for refugees, Dwight. They're in countries that are being persecuted for religious freedom and religious liberty. I don't think we ought to put a cap on anything like that at all. I think we ought to be as open as we possibly can be.
I agree. And I've done some research on how many refugees there are all over the world. And this is a constant challenge to countries, not just to the United States, but even in countries in South America where they are receiving refugees from one another. It's a real place where it's a great humanitarian crisis that's ongoing, and I'm glad to see that our country has a long history of dealing positively and warmly with refugees. Finally, from my home base in Brunswick, Georgia, I want to announce that the Meetinghouse will air a 4-part series entitled Race, Religion, and Us throughout the 4 Thursdays in the month of May. This will commemorate the arrest of 3 local men after 74 days of local inaction for the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. You will remember that this radio show was launched 1 week after Ahmaud Arbery was murdered on February the 23rd. And we broadcast just a few miles from where Ahmaud Arbery was murdered. I will review the episode and then throughout the course of the month, deal with the criminal, legal, political, and religious impact of that ugly episode. Among my guests will be the Reverend John Perry, president of the local NAACP, Rabbi Rachel Bregman of the local Jewish Temple, lawyer and former state senator William Ligon, and sometime resident and amateur videographer, my good friend Jim Jenkins. Others will be involved as well. That is Race, Religion, and Us in the month of May in the Meetinghouse. I look forward to that as we rehearse the tragedy that happened in Brunswick, Georgia, and the way it lit the fuse of racial unrest that traveled through Louisville, Kentucky, into Minneapolis, where it exploded and created a worldwide movement for racial justice. That's the news, sponsored by Perfecto Coffee of California. Order some of their coffee, perfectocoffeeinc.com. I'm going to be back in just a minute to talk about church after COVID, the decline in church membership in the United States, and answer the question, what in the world is going on with the Southern Baptist? I'll be back in a minute. Well, we've had a full year of COVID shutdown. My guest today is Dr. James Merritt, pastor of Cross Point Church in Atlanta. James, start off and tell us a little bit about the Cross Point Church. I think I remember when you launched the church a few years ago.
Yeah, Dwight, I was actually pastor of a great church, First Baptist Church, Snellville, for almost 18 years.
Right.
And when I was 50 years old, believe it or not, I left a super thriving, great church to start out in an elementary school with about 200 core people. Pardon me. And we've been at it almost now, in fact, 18 years. The first Sunday in May will be our 18th year. And God has blessed immensely. It was a hard slough at the beginning, I will tell you, but it's been a great adventure.
And the church is located in the northern suburbs of Atlanta. Am I not
That is
right?
correct. You know, we're in Duluth, Georgia, right off. We're about 25 miles northeast of downtown Atlanta.
Right. Now, are you all having in-person services yet?
We are. We went back last August. We went back to one. We were running multiple services. Went back to one. I pastor a really diverse church, Dwight. About 35% of our church is minority. So we went back in August. We're about to go to 2 services this September. But like a lot of churches, we're running around 40% of what we were. Tremendous online participation. I mean, it's just off the charts. We had this last Easter, we had over 7,000 just online.
I want you to expound on that a little bit, because this is the experience of people in churches, large and small, all over the country. They've discovered a whole new congregation out there.
Yeah, they really, and I'll tell you, Dwight, we've been in an advantage for one simple reason, because I've had a TV ministry for over 30 years. That really put us ahead of the game. We had the equipment, we had the know-how, we had the expertise, we had the staff. So really what we were doing is simply streaming what we've been doing for 30 years, post, after the fact. So it was really a big help. But what we're trying to figure out now, to be honest with you, is 2 things, Dwight. Number one, how do you really long distance through a screen disciple people? Because we still have the responsibility to make disciples. That doesn't go away. But then beyond that, how can we engage those people to get back to fellowshipping with the local body? Because I firmly believe the Bible is very clear that there is no substitute for that gathering of believers in the local church. And so we're trying to figure out those 2 things at the same time. It's very challenging. It's exciting, but it's very challenging.
James, I started an online Bible study 2 weeks ago. I've been wanting to do this for a long time. And so I finally started. I teach Monday night at 8 o'clock. I started with 22 people in the class, but they were from 10 different states. And I was really surprised at this. And another thing about this group is how many of the people who registered for the class are people who have not been participating in church life, not just for the last year, but for a long time, but have found, I'm sure not just in the case of my Bible study, but in the case of your Christian ministry, television ministry as well, that digital connection and digital participation can be powerful, can be transformational, and can create a genuine sense of community.
Yeah, it can. And again, it's like I tell people all the time, we don't Zoom Christmas with our families. There's something about getting together with your family in the house. And so I think that all of that, and you're right, I agree with everything that you're saying, but I think all of that is, for a pastor, should be always trying to build that bridge to get people to understand the importance and the value of coming together with a group of believers, worshiping together, serving together, learning together, fellowshipping together, and, as the author of Hebrews said, encouraging one another together. But to your point, Dwight, what a lot of people got to wake up and realize, for lack of a better way of putting it, the toothpaste is out of the tube, and the days of Radio Shack are gone. And if we don't engage them online, Dwight, somebody's going to for us. And we've got to really take the initiative and take advantage of using this new platform to do everything we can to get the gospel out and to make disciples.
Yes, I concur with this. I think this is going to be one of the permanent impacts of the COVID pandemic in church life. I remember telling my pastor, even before the COVID started, that he has an online congregation that probably is larger than his in-house congregation, and that this is going to be a permanent aspect of a pastoral and Christian ministry from here on out. Every church, I think, no doubt about it.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, Dwight, to be very frank and honest, I mean, we're going to get onto this subject, I know, but what COVID did too, Dwight, was accelerate the trend we were already beginning to see. You mentioned earlier in your program the drop off, not just in attendance, but just in affiliation. I'm sure you saw. I think it was about 3 weeks ago, Dwight, if I remember, for the first time in the history of our country, 51% of Americans say they're not affiliated with any church or any religion. 51. So we're now kind of in the minority. And so I believe that we were already seeing this, even in the mega churches. We were already seeing this trend, and I think COVID just accelerated that.
I agree. 3 weeks ago, my guest in the meeting house was Ryan Burge, who teaches at Eastern Illinois University, but he's also a Baptist pastor, and he wrote the book entitled The Nuns, who's leaving church, why they're leaving, and where they're going. And we had a terrific conversation. So I've been studying this. And then, of course, 2 weeks ago, Gallup came out with their numbers. I think the figure that they use is only 47% of the American population is now affiliated. I've written my commentary on that this week, which I will get to a little bit later. But this stuff you're saying doesn't surprise you.
No, it really doesn't. And as a matter of fact, this is even more startling. I think it was Barna that came out not long ago, Dwight, and they're now saying, the number that we've heard, Dwight, we heard it almost when we were back in seminary, that 40% of Americans go to church. We've heard that for 40 years. Now we know that the real figure is closer to 20.
Yes,
and
I agree.
If anybody doubts that, Dwight, I live in a community of 45 homes. I'll tell you, I wish it was 20%. Mm-hmm. I'm not even sure it's that high. But I would just encourage anybody that's a regular churchgoer, just think about your own neighborhood. Ask yourself, no matter where you live, no matter whether you live in the buckle of the Bible Belt or New York or California, how many of your neighbors are getting up, getting ready, and going to church? And I think you'll realize that's probably 20% is probably a lot closer to the number than 40.
Yes, it's sociologists recognize that when people fill out these surveys, they answer not necessarily truthfully, but how you want them to answer, or how they wish they could answer. That it's the numbers are fudged, not just in relation to religion stuff, but in relation to a lot of issues. We all remember how the pollsters were so wrong in the 2016 national presidential election. So where people are reluctant to, really tell the truth about what they're doing and how they're voting and all of that. But, Gallup and my friend Burge, they trace the modern decline in the numbers to the time period 1995 to 2000. And Burge has a long piece in his book about this, that what happened in America between 1995 and 2000 to push people away from their church affiliation. You remember what was going on? 94 was the contract with America politically, Newt Gingrich. 2000 was about the time that the internet started. And of course, Burge adds to both the internet and the politics, the continued secularization of American culture. What do you think about all this? What do you think is driving people away from church affiliation?
Dwight, I think it's because it's a multifaceted question, and I think there's so many answers. Let me just tell you one thing, and I don't mind admitting it. I think that the over politicization particularly of the church, has contributed to it. I think that, on the one hand, obviously we both believe in doing our civic duty and voting and having our convictions about certain things. But I believe that, we're at our best and our strongest when we're preaching the gospel, when we stick to what the Bible clearly teaches about the moral and ethical issues of our day, and we just kind of leave the politics to the politicians. I think that soured, I know it has, I think it soured a lot of people. I think also there is, on the other hand, just, Jimmy Carter used the term malaise. I think that there is an increasing secularization that's going on in the culture in the country. I don't think there's any question about that. I think that comes with globalization. I mean, more exposure to other religions and other faiths and so forth. I don't get too specific. I think the scripture does speak to this somewhat, and perhaps what's going to happen in the latter days. But I also believe that, it doesn't help when you have, whether it's a pastor that goes off the rails or whether you have a Falwell controversy or whatever. It just seems like every time we turn around, the church is hitting itself in the eye and sticking itself in the foot. So not trying to put the blame on the outside, let's look at the church. I think at times the church has been our own worst enemy.
Well, I agree with this. I wrote a column 2 weeks ago about the larger issues about how the church was not dealing well with the issues that have confronted it, from science to sex, from climate change to gender stuff. But I had a long talk with a pastor in Minneapolis this week who came out of Southern Baptist life, whom I met as a colleague in Owensboro, Kentucky, and is now the worship minister at a large Lutheran church. And we talked about the impact of the George Floyd murder on Minneapolis in general and on the churches. I had talked to him minutes after George Floyd died a year ago. And he talked about how they had to redo their entire worship service to interject the liturgies of lament into their worship service in order to deal with the emotional crisis that their whole city was dealing with. And he said over the course of the year, as they tried to address not only the local legal stuff, but the broader social justice stuff, that it brought a level of discomfort to their congregation, so much so that a number of their families left the church. So staying away from politics is one thing, but dealing with, like we have had to do down in Brunswick, Georgia, dealing with the racial stuff is pushing us on the other side. And it's not easy to be in the middle of all this, is it?
No, it's not. And I will give you an example. As I told you, I pastor a very diverse church. So after the whole George Floyd incident, I actually had a panel of two or three African-American brothers on the stage with me on a given Sunday.
Right.
I preached a message on racism and so forth.
Right.
But then I said, we need to hear from their experience. See, when you make a statement like this, it makes some people upset. But the truth of the matter is, Dwight, you and I don't know what it's like to be black in America.
That's amen to that.
We don't know. And I made a statement at our convention a couple of years ago and got a little heat for it. I just simply made one statement. I said, no matter where you are, I think it would behoove people of my color to talk less and listen more to our African-American brothers and sisters and the minorities and people who've come from other countries to hear their experience. I don't know what it's like, Dwight, to be able to say, I can only trace my ancestry back so far because at this point, my great-great-great-great-grandfather was sold to somebody and we lost track of who he was. Right. We don't know that. We don't know what that's like. So, I think that what the church ought to see is happening is this is an opportunity for us to humbly listen to our African-American brothers and sisters, to begin to, talk with them and hear their heart. I really believe that's part of the problem, Dwight. People are talking past each other and over each other rather than to each other. I have a text thread going with 4 African-American brothers in my church. right now. I've got a text. In fact, we call it church brothers. They're African Americans. They trust me. I trust them. I'm able, Dwight, to send them articles that present one side, and then the other side. We have feedback. We have dialogue. I've learned from them. They've learned from me, and it's been a great thing for me.
Well, there needs to be a whole lot more of that, and I'll have to say that I have upped my reading on all of this over the last 5 years. I got in contact with Dr. Kevin Cosby, the pastor of the great St. Stephen's Baptist Church in Louisville, Kentucky. And he started feeding me books, and I've just been devouring this stuff and realized I have lived a white life and a white church and a white Christianity most of my life. And I agree with you. We need to not only listen to what our Black brothers are saying, but believe them when they tell us stories about their experiences. And of course, this, is part of what's roiling the Southern Baptist Convention right now. I've watched this, trying to figure out, Ralph West out there in Houston is a friend of mine. I've been in the services a number of times. They hosted festivals of young preachers back when I was leading the Academy of Preachers. And he has took a stand on this. So how is this affecting life in the Southern Baptist Convention, James?
Well, I think that's a question yet to be answered, Dwight. I think that we're actually, in the middle of dealing with it, and it's a difficult time. There's no question about it. I'm one of my best friends in the world is Fred Luter, who was the first African American president of the SBC.
Yes.
In fact, I pat myself on the back when I say this, but I actually introduced Fred to the SBC when I was president of the pastors conference. I had him preach for me. And of course, Fred can preach the stars down. So the rest is history. I actually advocated for Fred years before he was elected. I advocated behind the scenes for him to be the president of the Southern Baptist Convention. And so, I think that we're right now in the middle of a deep, heartfelt, emotional discussion. I think with brothers who mean well on both sides. I think, my own personal opinion, Dwight, I think there's a lack of communication. I think there is some miscommunication. And I think we need to have more communication where we come in without guns blazing, without preconceived notions, so to speak, and begin to talk to one another. My mentor was Adrian Rogers. I know you know who Dr. Rogers was. He was my mentor. Dr. Rogers said one of the greatest things I've ever heard anybody say, Dwight. He said, there are no problems too big to solve, just people too little to solve them. I believe that. And I have the faith as a Southern Baptist. I do believe that we eventually have people who have big enough hearts, humble enough minds, and sweet enough spirits to try to really get to where we can begin to make progress on the issue. That's my prayer anyway.
A few weeks ago, in part of my news, one of my news stories, it may have been maybe connected with the Beth Moore stuff or Ralph West. I made a list of 6 issues that are facing Southern Baptists. I want to read these off to you because while I'm no longer in the Southern Baptist system, as you know, all of my education formation as a Christian, my baptism, all was in the context of Southern Baptist life. So here are 6 things. The sexual abuse scandal that so motivated Beth Moore and has the Me Too movement, hashtag Me Too, all of that. The race relations, this CRT issue that the seminary presidents dealt with, the lingering issue of Calvinism, which irritates still a lot of people in the convention, the declining statistics of membership and baptisms in Southern Baptist life, even pre-COVID, this dispute between the New State Conventions and NAM, the North American Mission Board, about how they need to cooperate or not. And then this new organization called the Network, which positions itself as the conservative pushback against what they see as liberalism in the convention, a kind of rehash of what you and I went through 40 years ago. These are very serious issues facing the convention, and in 2 months, they're all going to gather. You're going to be there, I'm sure, in Nashville. What's going to happen?
Well, it sounds like, first of all, Dwight, you know more about the SBC than I do, and you're not even in it anymore. So I just wrote all of these down, and you're exactly right. Some of these have been with us for a while. You probably don't know this, Dwight. I'm unfortunate. I say unfortunately, I was asked, so I served, but I reluctantly accepted the chairmanship of the resolutions committee for the SBC this year.
Oh,
and it's a landmine, I can assure you, and particularly some of these issues that you mentioned. Dwight, to be honest with you, and I'm not trying to avoid your question, I don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
I think that there is, Dwight, we both were there when the conservative resurgence was taking place, and
Right.
the tension that was there, and I was a part of that.
Yeah.
This is the most tension and division I've seen in the convention in 25 years.
No question about that.
There's no question. There's no question about it. And my answer to this, I don't know what's going to happen. I know what I hope will happen. I have said openly and publicly that my goal with the resolutions committee is to try to be as positive in our resolutions as we can be, to try to be more of a unifying force rather than a divisive force in our convention. At the same time, to speak with clarity and conviction to issues that we believe are biblical and need to be addressed. But it's definitely, I'm being honest, it's a landmine. We're walking.
It is a landmine.
And it's very difficult.
Of course, much of this focuses on the presidential election of the Southern Baptist, and I don't know all the issues here, but I do know that the mission people, the new states, are running a candidate from the Northwest. Dr. Moeller from Southern Seminary is running after he came out in favor of Donald Trump. That there's a black candidate running for president, and then this network, this conservative network, their leader is running for the president. Who do you think is going to win? Who do you want to win?
Well, I won't answer the last question. I've got my own personal opinion. I want God's man in the end, but I will say, and I'm being honest with you, I'm really, if I would not mind answering the second question, I've had an opinion. I don't know. This is where we are. I'm being honest with you, Dwight. As a convention, I would be less than honest if I said they all have an equal chance. I'm not going to say that, but I will say that probably there are three that you've mentioned, and you figure out who they are, that probably have the best chance of winning. And right now, I have to be honest, if you told me it was one of those three, neither one of those would surprise me.
Yeah.
That's where things are, right now. I will say this, Dwight, you've known me for a long time. I'm a conservative. I don't make any bones about it.
Yeah.
You know that. But it does somewhat startle even me, people that know me, when a network comes out as the, quote, conservative Baptist network. I mean, all I'll say is this, Dwight, you know me, you can vouch. James Merritt's not a liberal. Whatever I am, I'm not a liberal. You'll have
know that.
For that. You've known me. So I just find that to be, in a way, kind of surreal that after the conservative resurgence, we now have a group calling themselves the conservative. And I don't say that disrespectfully. I just find it's just strange.
I found it very strange. The same as you. Those of us who have watched the Southern Baptist Convention solidify what we would call its conservative or fundamentalist identity, and then for a group inside of it to say, well, it's not conservative enough.
Yeah.
This caught me by surprise. I was shocked at it. I did a program in the meeting house with your friend Herschel York. And he sent me a personal greeting to you when he found out you were going to be on the show today. Yeah. But and he and I talked about this. It is difficult for us now, kind of on the outside, to figure out what is going on, and can there be cohesion? Is there a threat? Are you facing the kind of threat that the United Methodists are? They're certainly going to split, just like the Anglicans split away from the Episcopalians. Is there going to be another split in the SBC?
You know, I'm going to be optimistic. I don't think so. Now, I would be less than honest if I said there may be some major splintering. I would say that's a real possibility. The thing I would also say, Dwight, is this. My prayer is that we can come together on what the true essentials are, not just of the faith. That would always be the first thing, but that we could come together on some of these issues where we may, not always agree, but we can agree even whether it's the racism issue or whether it's recognizing that women are gifted and can serve in church in many ways, et cetera, that we can come together in a way where we can walk together and be basically agreed without people thinking that they have to leave. I will say, and I may said this publicly, if we're going to reach, if the Southern Baptist Convention is going to viably continue to be a gospel force in America, we have got to expand our leadership. We have got to expand our demographics. We have got to reach out to the minorities because they are, as you know, 2050 says we are going to be the minority and they're going to be the majority. So just from a practical standpoint, Dwight, forget everything else. We have got to do that, I believe, if we're going to continue to be a viable force for the gospel.
Yes, I agree with this. And because this is true, the loss of people like Beth Moore and Ralph West, both of them there in Houston, is not a good sign for the convention. How they can overcome those two defections and all that represents and still move in the direction that you envision. I hope you can you get a resolution to that effect to diversify the SBC? Is that part of your opportunity as chairman of this committee?
Well, I don't, and just to be honest, I don't know that resolution would be in the purview of a resolutions committee. I would say that resolution or not, that should be a resolve of the convention regardless. There's no question about that.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. But I do want you to know that I have followed your ministry and I do pay attention to what's going on in the Southern Baptist Convention as I report on everything. And because it is still the largest Protestant network of Christians in the United States, and what happens in the SBC impacts a lot of things. And God bless you right in the middle of all of it in Atlanta on the resolutions committee. Wow. Well, we may have to come back after the convention and talk again, James, about what happened and what it means. But I want to thank you for being in the meeting house today and talking with us and with my listeners and watchers about you, your ministry, your church, and the broader Southern Baptist Convention.
Well, Dwight, thank you. And, I love you as a brother in the Lord. Again, a lot of fond memories on that campus in Louisville, a lot of exciting times. I remember us being together in some seminars and colloquiums and other things. And it's just really good to see you again, my brother.
Thanks. God bless you. I send the same word back to you. And I hope our paths cross for a face-to-face meeting really soon. God bless you. This is the Meeting House, and I'm your host, Dwight Moody. I'll be back in just a minute with my commentary. Are people quitting church? Really? The death of Prince Philip and the conviction of Derek Chauvin, both last week, excuse me, displaced the striking news of the week before, what we've already been talking about here on the show, that church membership in the United States has fallen below 50% of the population. However, the funeral of the prince occurred in a Christian chapel with Anglican and Orthodox elements included in the liturgy. And as all of us watched Minneapolis, we noticed people praying in the streets before, during, and after the verdict was announced by the judge. Religion was everywhere, it seemed. except in the local church. Or so Gallup and his interpreters would have us believe. But the truth of the matter is this: church affiliation in the United States has not always been what we think. We've not always been a church-going people. In fact, church affiliation grew very slowly from the 1600s right up to 2000. In colonial days, only 17% of the people were affiliated with the church, but by the turn of the millennium, the year 2000, that was 70%. Much of the growth between that 17% and the 70% was fueled by two things. First, the women. The women moved to the frontier and, shall we say, civilized the whole thing, which included building churches and schools. One scholar of American history wrote this, quote, "Most of America, even in the 18th century, was still untamed frontier, filled with untamed frontiersmen who preferred drinking and wrenching to tithing and praying," end quote. Then came, after the women, the itinerant evangelist moving throughout the land. They Christianized the whole thing. The first name I want to mention, Englishman George Whitefield, brought his portable pulpit. It was a wooden contraption that folded out. He could set it up in a field. He preached to thousands gathered in open fields in the years prior to the Revolution. He died in 1770. His contemporary, the great Jonathan Edwards, remained in Western Massachusetts most of his ministerial career, but his preaching influenced the whole country. Together, they led what we now call a Great Awakening, and many unchurched people found their way into the waters of baptism. But still, when that shot heard round the world was fired near Concord Bridge, the country, more than 80% of the population, was largely unchurched. A century later, another wave of gospel work pushed up the membership numbers. Over the mountains in what was then the West, that is Kentucky, my home state, Barton Stone launched what came to be known as the Restoration Movement, gathering great throngs of people to frontier meeting houses for meetings that lasted for days and weeks. They gave rise to the traditions that we now call churches of Christ, or the disciples of Christ, independent Christian churches. All of that came out of that great revival movement. In Western New York, at about the same time, a lawyer turned evangelist named Charles Finney set things on fire, emotionally and spiritually. They called his region the Burned Over District. Before his death in 1875, he had spread the gospel to New York City and then moved to Ohio. Church membership in the country doubled from 17% to 35% between the wars. And then I haven't even mentioned Joseph Smith, the golden tablets, and the origins of the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints. That all started in New York also, about 1830, but ended up in Utah. We call them Mormons today. And then after the Civil War came Dwight L. Moody, who died in 1899, and then the radio, and then the television, and finally Billy Graham, who lived 100 years, 1918 to 2018. By the end of the 20th century, church membership had doubled again from 35% to 70% of the population. All of these numbers researched and tabulated by the well-known professor of sociology, Rodney Stark, then at the University of Washington. He published a book entitled The Churching of America. And now we're told the numbers have retreated from the millennial high water mark. But I want to suggest that perhaps the church years of 1950, when I was born, to 2000, that is 50 years of my own life, were an anomaly rather than the norm. They were fueled by the post-war baby boom and the lingering influence of my own generation, the boomers. But now, not so much. We and our offspring are ignoring many things we once thought greatly significant, such as church and civic clubs and bowling leagues. Remember the 2000 book, Bowling Alone, by the Harvard professor Robert Putnam? It carried the subtitle, The Collapse and Revival of American Community. It was not just church that was taking a hit. And then this week, as I was preparing this essay, two statistics came across my desk. In 1970, there were 61 births in America per 1,000 population, 61. In 2020, there were 17 per 1,000, 61 versus 17. Again, it's not just the church that's changing its behavior. And now the clincher, the audience for Sunday night football television. The attendance has dropped 21% in the last year. And young adults are now watching 77% fewer minutes on television than they did in 2015. The times they are changing, Bob Dylan sang so many years ago. That was 1964. I was a teenager. They're still changing in so many areas of modern American life. So it's not just church life that's having to adjust. I don't even think I told you that my 3 middle-aged children, all 3 of them, are single, not even married. That's a big change. In the face of all this change, as a minister, I invoke the biblical word, first in Haggai and then in Hebrews. The first in the Hebrew Bible and then in the Christian Testament. I will shake not only the earth, but the heavens also. The removal of what is shaken, so that what cannot be shaken can remain. I'm Dwight Moody in the Meeting House. I'll be back in a minute with a final word. Thank you for joining us in the Meeting House this week. I'm your host, Dwight A. Moody, coming to you from North Carolina this week. I'm interested in what you think about leaving church. Write me about your experience, about your kids, about yourself. Have you left church? Tell me why. Visit the website, themeetinghouse.net. You can read all the commentaries, book reviews, watch this podcast, subscribe to the weekly newsletter. It comes out every Wednesday. Join us next week. My guest will be the popular author Brian McLaren on his new book, Faith After Doubt. I have it here on my shelf just behind me. I've just started reading it. It deals a lot with what we've been talking about today. And then after that, my 4-part series on race, religion, and us. Thank you for listening today. We had a hard time getting started because of the technical difficulties. But thank you for tuning in over the radio, YouTube, the website, Facebook. Thanks to my engineer, Everett Armstrong, in the Golden Isles of Georgia, and Alex Mattingly in the Louisville studios. Thanks to all of you today, especially my guest, Dr. James Merritt, an old friend of mine. Thank you for listening. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm up to 405. I've been stuck there for weeks. Until next week, do justice, love mercy, wear a mask, get a vaccine. As soon as this show is over today, I'm headed out the door to go get my second shot. I hope you're getting a vaccine. Wash your hands, wear a mask, drink some coffee, order some coffee, send a donation. Go to themeetinghouse.net/support. Pray for the soul of America. Be kind. I'm in the Meeting House. I'm Dwight A. Moody. Have a great day.